No. Jeff probably did.
The last one here.
When you're late, you hit every stoplight.
I only hit one
Oh,
coming
I hit them all.
through, so I beat you by a minute and a half.
Okay, at time being 3 o'clock, we'll call the meeting to order. Let's see, we'll have to
Roll call.
do a roll call.
Markwart,
Here.
Heine,
Here.
Barkle,
Here.
Loest,
Here.
Nelson,
Here.
and Welsh.
And
Okay, first item of on the agenda is approval of the minutes.
Financial conflicts.
Oh, sorry, yes, financial conflicts. Anyone have any financial conflicts? Missed that first one.
Welch, no.
Markwart, no.
Heine, no.
Loest, no.
Nelson, no.
Barkle, no.
Okay, this second item on the agenda is approval of last meeting's minutes from last Wednesday.
Move approval.
Second.
Okay. Approved by Markwart, second by Welsh, and all in favor say aye.
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 And nay, or negative, and passes unanimously. Okay, approval of the agenda. Pretty short and simple. I did kind of put together, I don't know, somewhat of a structure of our discussion here. I thought, I just, as I was reading through ordinances, I was gonna try to have this somewhat organized.
Did you want this part of the agenda or just,
That's just kind of like to help structure our item 5.
I'll move to approve the agenda for our meeting today.
I'll second.
All right. Moved by Markwart, second by Nelson. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, nay, and passes. Okay. Now we have now is the time for public comment. Do we have any public comment?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Robert Burns, and I live in Yankton, South Dakota. I've relocated from Nebraska, where I was involved for almost 20 years in solar, wind, methane, biomass, biodiesel, kinds of energy forms. I'm an organic chemist from the University of Massachusetts, and I kind of stumbled across this topic being bandied about, so I figured I would chime in for what it was worth. We do have some experience in South Dakota with smaller systems, and I'll talk mostly just in my experience and working with the small stuff. I have had some exposure to zoning in the bigger stuff in my previous county, Burt County, Nebraska, and some of the zoning that was set up for both wind and solar at that time. But I'll speak mostly from my experience with the small stuff. I did review zoning that would have been, and visited with the zoning officials here in Yankton City, and it seems like they have some basic, they're not zoning commercial size solar at all, nor should they, but on the small side, they did seem like they had some reasonable setbacks and property lines and just basic stuff that was already in place. I visited with their zoning person down there, and they felt it was adequate, and I would agree. So there are lots of people involved in this process. You have one is zoning. Two is the actual power company. And here with Northwestern Power, there's 4 tiers that are set up to do an interconnection to the grid. That authority for them to regulate that comes from the fact that you are connected to the grid. I had a disagreement with the power company years ago, and I told them to take their pole and their wire and you know where. That, if there is no physical interconnection between the power grid and the power producer, the power company is not involved. And depending on the zoning, state fire marshal, or not, the state electrical inspector may not be involved. That's in Nebraska. Like on ag zones and stuff, you don't have that, they don't have that jurisdiction. But typically, if it is grid connected, they will require UL 1741 requirements that the inverter that takes the whatever power that you're generating, refines it, and puts it to grid quality. And that equipment needs to be stamped. That's certified both in your application to the power company, and the electrical inspector is going to be looking for that, which is going to inspect any grid connected system. So there's already kind of a, don't feel like you're the only one that has to put limitations on there, because there's some that are already covered, there's some that is not, but there's certainly, there's certainly some open area. I think the exposures that you might consider on solar, which is very different from wind, two different animals completely. The company abandons the project. That would be the biggest one. I think is that they just walk away, and it's the cheapest thing. Like, we had a massive hail damage, and I'll speak to hail, but there was one out in, I think it was Scotts Bluff or something out west that just got pummeled. If the whole company walks away from that, what happens there? So typically a bond or some kind of a cleanup bond or something is put out in that kind of a situation. So the county is not stuck on the hook with that for cleanup and disposal. Solar panels are benign in that they're solids. It's a silicon laminate sheet with a Tedlar back sheet and a glass on the front. So there's no hazards. It's not sharp glass, but it's not a water contamination hazard or anything like that. They should be disposed in a certain manner, but they don't pose any physical threat, remediation kind of a issue if there's a big mess. I talked to Ryan a little bit about this in terms of where you guys draw the line. There's a lot of numbers out there. Northwest Energy has less than 10, 50 or less, 1 megawatt and more. What number? There's a federal tax credit out there that enables 26% of the installed cost to be written off your tax burden as a tax credit. You hate to limit access to those. When we formulated the net metering statutes in Nebraska, they limited it to 25 kW. And in my mind, we left a lot of money on the table. Our original bill was 100 kW, but power lobby in Nebraska is the largest lobby in Nebraska. And they limited it to 25, but it really kind of left a lot of money on the table there as far as the tax credit. So it may behoove you, just to keep things simple, to kind of define a generation site. And customer generator is a term that's typically used for people who are generating their own power. Is it set up for export or consumption? And most small sites will use what they make, and there may be times where they export to the grid, and there's an interchange there, but it's primarily set up for on-site consumption. Where a commercial, much larger system, the smallest I've ever seen, I think, is 200 kW on a res in Nebraska. But they're set up with a meter, there's no consumption, it's all exported, and its monetary value is defined between a contract between the producer and the receiver. So that's kind of that may be a break point to set up the systems that you want to more closely monitor as export or consumption sites. On the small stuff, like what I already saw in place in Yankton City, setbacks from the property line. 3 feet from the roof edge I saw, which seems kind of strange in zoning, maybe not, but that is good, solid engineering. If you're putting solar panels on a roof, that they should be away from all of the edges of the roof, and there's an engineering design behind that. When you build solar in Nebraska and South Dakota and all the northern states, you're building for wind, not just solar. So wind is very destructive, if not properly designed, can be very destructive on solar panels, keeping them away from edges, watching your incident angles, overbuilding, watching your mile per hour ratings on construction and design are all very important parts of the picture. So it was a good thing to be in there. Again, setbacks will range. Aircraft may become involved because of potential reflection, especially if we have an airport in the area. That may be something to consider on the large side. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about on panels themselves. They are pretty tough. We have a number of maybe dozen systems on the Flange Santee-Sioux Reservation in Flange, South Dakota. I'm going to be up there next week. We've got another project up there. If anybody, or as a group or individually, ever wanted to coordinate to come up and see those, it's nice to see. The biggest one, I think, is 60 kW. But I consider them, in what I've done over these years with solar, kind of as like a third generation, because it's not just, okay, here's my solar design, I'm just going to stick it here on the ground. We actually tried to go back and integrate the solar into the property so that it actually adds, or at minimum does not subtract from the visual impact of the site. This can be done by elevating ground mounts to make live spaces underneath, making them disappear on a roof. Integrating them into the architecture, I think, is the next level. And we've seen that kind of stuff in Europe, who's been doing this, I think, more extensively, where they actually make it visually appealing. So those are, if anybody's interested in that, we can do that. But they had this past spring, they had 120-mile-an-hour winds. And the systems all survived, as they were designed to do, except for one ground mount system, because I guess there was a construction porta potty that was on the site, and it was bouncing against the solar from the wind, but that we couldn't help. And it is covered by homeowners insurance. For small producers, it is a permanent part of the property, 25-year warranty period on panels. They last a long time, and they are covered typically under homeowners insurance because they're physically connected to the home. On hail, we've seen some ugly cases of hail damage. And anybody who is, if you're building for wind, you're dropping your incident angles. That maximizes solar gain, gives you better protection against wind, shear, and uplift forces, but it makes you more exposed to hail. That is part of the risk we see. But typically, solar panels are pretty tough. 15 years, I never had any. We had hail, but I never had any panels break from hail. But it obviously does happen. But it's like, I don't know that that's a big detriment to the technology. It happens. It's typically covered by insurance. But it's not, in my mind, it's not a big factor for whether to do it or not. Okay, and again, I just wanted to mention wind is a different animal because you have the bonds, flicker, vibration, shadow, setbacks are a whole nother thing. Solar is just going to sit there. There may be a flicker involved, and typically it's not an issue unless you're in the air. So it should be a case. I also appreciate the 50 kW cutoff. To do something about it instead of just a moratorium on all solar. And because I do want to, we've moved up here now, I think there's an opportunity to do some small solar and different things for folks, not just energy production, but sustainability in general. So I appreciate the opportunity to throw a shingle out there and see what the people are looking for. So that was about all I had and what I wanted to share, and I'd be open for any questions.
Could I have you clarify that last comment on you're open to the 50 kW cutoff? What do you mean by that?
Well, there's been in the last county board, I guess was Tuesday night, they recommended a moratorium on solar over 50 kW, and then anything over 50 kW, you have to do a special use permit and all that, where under 50 kW might be able to proceed in the meantime until this is all lined out.
Okay,
So I think that's a responsible way to proceed.
okay, for short term. What about long term?
Well, long-term is what you're coming up with.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that you agreed with that cutoff, because right now it looks like we're heading the direction you can do pretty much in any place in the county less than 50 kW, no requirements. And then anything over 50 kW, and we haven't talked about a limit on size yet, would be required to have a conditional
Have
use
some sort-
permit
Okay.
and only be in certain areas, ag and commercial. So are you saying you agree with those, I'll call them endpoints, if you will?
Well, I agree. I think that's a responsible way to proceed. It's a process. It takes time. We're looking at probably March to have this thing on the books. So I think that sounds a lot, as a citizen of the county, I think that sounds a lot more reasonable than saying you can't do solar till we say you can.
Okay. Do you think long-term there should be a limit to the size of these? So if
I
we
don't
say,
think, not say you can't, no, not an endpoint size. The bottom point size is gonna take care of itself. Because in my experience, to get the proper electronics and all the electrical inspection level stuff, it's gonna be $3,000-4,000 is probably your minimum investment. So the starting point is probably gonna size itself. On the upper size, if you have everything covered in terms of setbacks and disposal and flicker, and I don't think you should have to cap it. So South Dakota is, the solar epicenter of this country is in like the Southwest. Nebraska actually pulls out a number 10 or 11 in solar potential. South Dakota's like 13-ish in solar potential. So I don't think you're gonna have people beating the door down up here, because several months of the year, there's not gonna be potentially any production. So it is something it is kind of a hole, but I don't think it's ever gonna be really big up here. You've got good power prices, which is normally a big driver. And you don't have a tremendous solar resource, so you don't really have the economic conditions really for it to be a giant operation here in the state.
So I think, to kind of beat it a little more, is the 50 kilowatt as a cutoff for where we start really looking at it, requiring conditional use permit and all that, just because I guess my feeling, and I think the rest of the board's feeling, was at 50 kilowatts or less, that's more of like home use or personal use systems that don't really require us to be that involved with, whereas anything over that we should be more involved with. Do you think that's a reasonable point to separate? Does that cover most?
I think it
personal
does.
use?
I think it does, but when you're looking at numbers and you look at other numbers, like, well, if I could use 60 kW here and it would all qualify for the federal tax credit, and that 100 kW by the feds is kind of their definition of small energy system. So when you get into the numbers, it could be tricky. I think there should be, anytime you connect to the grid, if you're off the grid, whatever, I don't think you want to mess with that. It's going to be so rare, and only crazy people do that stuff. But, I'm laughing at myself. But I think there should be a trigger for any, just for if you're outside city limits and you're in the county and you're going to tie into the grid, I think it would be responsible to say you got to at least be 50 feet back. You know, just a couple basic things, so you just avoid property line issues or problems. Just a couple basic things. And then when you get to the point where you're an exporting site, and you might define it as an exporting site, not 50 or 100. I mean, most solar systems are gonna be less than 20. But you do have opportunities out in the country or small commercial where they could use every lick of that, you know, up to 100. I think you should do something obviously more extensive for larger than 50K, if you want to use a number. And I think that's a responsible thing to do, and less than 50K. And the permitting fees, less than 50 KW, you know, 30 bucks, whatever, 50 bucks. For over that, it should be a percentage of the KW, or some kind of a, something that goes off the capacity.
Right now, our ordinance for building permits is set off the value of the project, a certain percentage of the value.
It's about
Just-
$2
just for
a
your
watt.
reference.
I mean, installed cost for a commercial system is like $2 a watt. So either way, it's pretty linear.
Rob, to follow up on, and just put things in perspective a little bit, a 50 KW system would occupy about how much square footage
Oh, that's a good question.
approximately?
It's about 15 watts per square foot, I believe, on a mono panel. And that's too much math without a calculator.
Yeah.
That's a good size, 50, okay, I've got 50s or 60 in Flandreau in the lot next to their medical center. And it's about 12 feet wide, 3 rows with 12 feet, because you have to watch shadow when you do ground mount. You have to have them set back far enough that one's not shading the other. So maybe 20 feet in between, so there's 40. 3 rows that are 12 feet, so 36, 76 wide by 80 feet, 60 feet long.
Okay. So
You know, that gives you a general
80 by
idea.
80 roughly would be big enough to hold a 50 KW system. Rob, talk to us a little bit about the inverters and whether or not we have, let's say, the quality of inverters available for a home system or even a small commercial system that would allow it to connect to the utility without upsetting the voltage and cycle.
The sine wave, the 60 hertz sine wave is
Yeah.
probably the most sensitive. When I did my thing back in Nebraska, there weren't a whole lot of options like that available. So it was either like you're in or you're out kind of a thing. Now they have a lot of, I would draw if I had someone. Can I use a dry erase?
That's not a dry erase.
I like to do sketches, but
You're inside there.
There's a,
There.
it looks like a damn nice dry erase.
Oh, yeah.
oh, the screen comes,
Yeah.
okay. I thought,
Oh, the screen comes
Oh.
down. Yeah, I thought it was a screen too. Okay.
Is what's on there, okay?
You can erase that.
But that's a true statement, that technology has changed, and, you know, it's almost like, I think it's pretty stable now. It has changed a lot, panel sizes, panel cost, a lot of those things have changed over the last decade. But you gotta be careful when you're very specific with technology on zoning. Wind, small scale, is like twice as much as solar now, in this less than 50 KW scale. Wind is a lot more expensive than solar, and it's a lot more maintenance. And that's changed. I mean, that's something recently that's come about. Thank you. So if you've got the home, okay, and you've got, I'll just put some solar out here. Solar is produced always as DC.
Right.
It's DC current coming out, and these will be wired in a certain way, up to 600 volts. I think they have 1,000-volt systems now, DC, that things are rated for, but in any case, it's coming out of here DC. The first is the conversion box, okay? If you're going to battery storage, you're keeping it as DC, you're just bringing your voltage down. So if you're coming down here to batteries, This is called a charge controller. And you're not, this never see, no grid interfaces here on this side. If you're coming out of here as AC, this is DC, charge controller. If you're doing the conversion to AC, this is an inverter. So now you're actually converting the power to the usable form of the AC system. This is going to have here's your meter. You can bring it in anywhere behind, it's called behind the meter if you're self-consuming. So your power, your grid power stuff is coming in here, obviously. Your sub panel or main panel, whatever, you just drop this in your main panel. And then all your other stuff goes into the house. And this will be consumed, your typical and the most common, the best ROI, the best bang for your buck system is just a simple grid intertie system. No batteries, no storage. Okay, DC, AC, and you put it into your live box. Now, you can't tell how much you're using unless you meter this. Some charge controllers will have this, but you may want to put your own meter on this. In Nebraska, part of the net metering law required utilities to do that because they wanted them to report this number. Because otherwise, I mean, you'll see your bill go down, but yeah, I mean, you don't know how much that is. Sometimes the inverters will have this stored as to what they put out, but then what's that not telling you? What it's not telling you, it's just telling you the total that left this box. What it's not telling you is how much went back to them. Okay, which you want to minimize. Like when I look at a system, you know, when you look at the power curve, January to December, most homes will have what I call the single hump consumption model, which is your cooling in the summer, everything else is pretty good. So if you wanted to economically attack this consumption profile by offsetting your retail purchases, instead of paying 13 cents per power, you know, that's where you're going to get your savings, is knocking that retail purchase down. You probably want to go for something here. You know, if you put it here, this is, you know what they give you for this power? If you send it back, 1 penny per kilowatt hour. So, and then it goes down your driveway, down the road, down your neighbor's driveway, and they get 15 cents for it, or whatever the retail is. So, you don't need to be involved in subsidizing the power company. So we try to minimize this stuff as much as possible. Now, if you have storage, that's a different scenario. Okay, there's another hump, there's another model that you can consider where it's actually like this. Any ideas? Electric heating. If people are heating their homes with electric, it generally dwarfs their cooling consumption. Okay, so, all right, so it's kind of a long story, but if you're taking this right back to the grid as AC 220, you're dropping it in the panel, this box needs to be UL 1741. The NEC code has had some updates in recent years. It's hard to even keep track of them. Sometimes the state electrical inspector is looking for this though. You got some flash deals and fire stuff and different things that NEC has added, National Electric Code has added over the years, but that's all done with the state electrical inspector. About 60 hertz.
Yeah, we do, we are spending a lot of time.
I'm sorry,
so-
I didn't want to
yeah.
take too much time. Any other questions? Okay.
I have a question. Do you have any experience in Nebraska? Does Nebraska have a PUC that they have to, so anything, like for example, in South Dakota, anything over 100 megawatts, it has to get approval by the PUC in South Dakota. Does Nebraska have a state agency that sets requirements or sets conditions?
It's Nebraska Public Power.
Okay,
It is a public power state. It's 100%. So they do a lot of the roles. The PUC, there is a PUC in Nebraska, but it's generally for like gas and other types of utilities. And anything certainly over 1 megawatt in Nebraska, you have to apply to the transmission queue so they can do the study,
Okay.
the system study to determine if the existing lines can even, accommodate this. And that's, of course, something that you may want to peek into a little bit, because you don't want to have your ratepayers on the hook for subsidizing somebody's economic project, because the infrastructure needs to get built out. Because ultimately, the power company can get paid for it, we are.
Yeah.
So that's an excellent point, because that can come up. And if we'll provide it, economic investment, attract that, well, at the end of the day, it's the ratepayer that pays that. But there's a long queue in Nebraska, and then once that study's done, then a PPA, or the power purchase agreement, is done between them. Say, we'll give you whatever, 3.5 cents for your power, blah, 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 and then they go from there. So that's got its own process.
Okay.
Thanks for
Any
your input,
further
Rob.
questions?
Thanks, Rob.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
appreciate it.
Guy Larson, Yankton County resident. I'm going to keep this pretty short. I sent John an email, I don't know if you saw it. There was a news release about a solar farm in New Underwood out in the west, done by National Grid Renewables. They just announced a $500,000 grant to the school district, $25,000 a year for 20 years from their solar facility that's under construction right now. That facility also looks to be generating $12 million over that 20-year period in property taxes. So there is a genuine upside to these solar farms if somebody wants to develop them. And, I'm right on board with having adequate protections in the zoning ordinance to make sure that you get a facility that you're happy with when it's done. But they can be a big benefit to the community. Another thing that I'll just mention regarding having small-scale solar and not realizing much getting paid back from the grid, the Sierra Club is joining with Dakota Rural Action to fund a study, which has been done in other states, to demonstrate the benefits to the power companies of having independent solar generation on the grid and establishing a reasonable rate. This all is because of Black Hills Energy. They have to redo their payback structure. At this point, their proposal is that if you want to sell your surplus electricity to the grid, what they're proposing is that you have to sell every kilowatt you produce to them for 2.4 cents a kilowatt hour. And you have to buy all of your electricity from them at market rate. So this study is being done to actually show what their benefits are from having the locally produced solar. And what they've come up with in Wyoming, the number is, over 10 cents is what they should be paying. I'm not sure of the exact amount. But that's something that the Sierra Club has partnered with them, hoping that we can take this to peer and say, the PUC right now pretty much throttles it at 2.4 cents. But we're hoping to get them to try to encourage solar development, both at a local, just a personal level, individual level, and at the solar farm level. So that's all.
Okay, any further public comment? All right. Well, then we will move on to our discussion, and I did sort of try to just structure this out because today we want to focus on kind of where these things should be, what kind of restrictions we want in terms of setbacks, locations. I've read through the Lynn County ordinance. I've read through the Clay County one. and then a couple others, and I just kind of came up with this short list. I guess we can kind of we'll start with just a general open discussion about the locations. We've already decided ag and commercial. I think we start right away, a lot of these farms. Okay, so a lot of these farms are large multi-acre, hundreds of acres in these cases of these larger farms. We don't have parcels like that. I know, Sherry, you've mentioned too about like the idea that we put a big setback on there, and then they buy 2 parcels. Now they have to abide, even though it's the same farm across the same thing. You end up with a large setback in there that they can't construct in. But then also, I've seen also in other places, so special setbacks for residential, and so I'm going to just open it up to sort of the location debate.
I read the Lynn County one also, and I believe they have the setbacks listed in there that is it Lynn County? No, actually the setbacks were in Clay counties.
Clay County had
The setbacks
had
listed.
specific setbacks, yes.
Yes. My only thought with theirs was, is 200 feet enough for a water setback? Public water? I mean, if we're concerned about any contamination coming off there, 200 feet is not very far.
Yeah, waters of the state. And the other one, I noted in there though too, is like, they had one on flood zone.
Looking at most of them that I've looked at, they do not allow them in 100-year or flood
Yeah.
zone,
Floodplain is
floodplain.
correct.
Yeah.
Because
I would agree.
like we said at the planning and zoning last month, I mean, it's flooded and you gotta go out and fix it. I don't think I wanna be the person to mix water with electricity.
Yep. But I know they have for dwellings, churches, schools, businesses, and cemeteries, 2,640 feet, that's a half a mile. I don't know, and I guess I don't know of anyone that would bring a 100-megawatt field farm in here, but there could definitely be somebody that'd bring 250 fields in, 50-megawatt fields, and that's less than a section. It would take less than a section of land to put a 50-megawatt field in.
Mm-hmm.
So I would be good with these setbacks if I would make a recommendation. We're gonna talk about, I would say then you talk about fencing and buffering and those kind of issues too, but,
Mm-hmm.
and again, these are just recommendations to our zoning board. I mean,
John, could you list those off again? I guess I don't have the Clay County one that you're referencing.
Okay.
I got waters of the state, 200 feet, dwellings, churches, schools, businesses, cemeteries, 2640, and incorporated municipality, 5280. And then they've got federal, state, and county roads, 150 feet. Designated 100-year flood district prohibited. Designated state and county parks, 5280. And additional 1,000 feet is what is in the Clay County drafted or ordinance.
Yeah, I guess that's pretty close to what's in the red line version that planning and zoning came up with. A couple more things that are in there, like we have, I guess like right-of-way line, which would be like roads or whatever. We got 330 feet in the red line version for Yankton County. Lakes, rivers, streams, 660 feet. Public wells, private wells, all that kind of stuff is listed out, and I guess at planning and zoning, thought was those are the facility setbacks that we impose on any ag livestock projects, so it only makes sense
Sure.
to have the same kind of thing going on for any other projects in the ag zone.
Well,
But
even
they're,
that's
they're
what I
really
said.
relatively close to,
And that's what I said, the 200-foot for the waters of the state, I think is too close also. You know, we could extend that out.
Right.
I don't know that we have a lot of areas in Yankton County that would be considered close to waters of the state other than Jim River, so.
And would that be in the floodplain anyway?
That would very likely be in
Yeah,
floodplain
because that ground
anyway.
would be under, yeah, it's a floodplain, yeah.
So,
yeah.
What, waters of the state, what is that, what is
it'd be
it?
like rivers and creeks, I suppose.
Streams, like-
Streams,
Just, well, okay.
I'm assuming.
Yeah, in the Yankton County, it just says lakes, rivers, and streams, so.
Yep.
Pretty general, but
I mean, is that could that be a problem though? Lakes, rivers, and streams. So like, where do you? What's a stream? When is it a stream?
There isn't any now.
You know?
well, I guess generally, I think what we go by is like the blue line map. So
Blue line.
You can overlay that on Beacon too if you want.
Okay.
Comes up and shows it pretty.
It's like,
Good picture of that.
do we have that kind of definition in the zoning ordinance? Like,
No, but, I think it's in the floodplain one, but yeah, that layer is out there, you can take a look at it.
okay. Because you know, I take it from the legal standpoint. You know, someone suddenly says, "Oh, I have a mud puddle here. This is water. This is a lake now." You know, and trying to extend the definition to unreasonable limits. You know, lawyers are great at these things. So.
And that has been the discussion for waters in the US for the last few
Mhm.
years here, so where do you draw that line?
Yeah, and I'd like to make sure that it's a clean one, rather than muddied.
What was the distance on lakes, rivers, and streams? I didn't get.
660 is
6.6 is what the,
is what Yankton County
Yeah.
is for CAFOs or, and then that's what was proposed for solar.
Now, these would just apply to those folks needing a CUP, which currently we say is anything over
50 kilowatts.
50.
Kilowatts.
So nothing within a mile of any city,
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
nothing within a half a mile of any residence. And I'm assuming if the resident says, I'm good with it, we'll
It'd be a
allow the
waiver.
exemption.
It'd be a waiver.
A waiver,
So
yeah.
you need to make sure that would be in there too.
Mhm.
Waivers are allowed.
That's in
I think
pretty
that's
much-
addressed later in the,
I guess the waiver thing is pretty consistent throughout the rest of our ordinance. Would
It's
do that.
only in ag.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
So that doesn't mean it's consistent throughout. It's only in ag. That's the
Alright.
only place it is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for hog barns, cattle barns, whatever it
I
is.
thought last week we did not include commercial zoned property, because the only commercial zoned property we have is Napa Junction.
We were discussing it, but yeah, we didn't really come up with a.
Yeah,
I had down that we included it.
I think it's a good idea to include it as well.
I don't have a problem with
mostly.
that, but I mean, then we need to add the waiver in there somewhere in the commercial property also.
Well,
Well, I think what we discussed is since it would be allowed in those two zones, that this would actually be a separate
Sep-
chapter,
Okay,
mhm.
standalone, just like,
Just like the wind is.
yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so then
29.
ag and commercial would then reference this
So
for,
then you
Okay,
just
that makes
basically
sense.
say, this is in the conditional use listed section there,
Mhm.
and refer it over to the next chapter, but.
that's number one bullet point. Right, the setbacks, these setbacks would be set up as our first actual bullet point.
yeah. And so I am gonna just say it, based on a lot of discussions I've had with a lot of different people, it does sound like maybe the half-mile setback is a bit much for residences and businesses.
I agree, I don't think it has to be that far, but if you
Well, it
wanna be
doesn't-
more consistent throughout the whole zoning ordinance, the whole zoning, or the whole ordinance
Mm-hmm.
setup, I don't have a problem with saying that.
So,
And if somebody isn't against that and allows it,
'Cause
They just gotta sign the waiver and you can go closer.
Yeah, and I'm just going on the alternate side. It's like, okay, we set the limit at 50 kilowatts. You have some farm out there that's like, oh, we really could use an 80 kilowatt system. Now they have to be a half mile from every residence and go out and get all these waivers for something that's just slightly larger, but they are still, for the most part, trying to use it directly on their farm or directly on their
I don't have a problem
location.
with it being less than a half a mile. I just
So-
thought that would be the number that most residents would wanna see.
Mhm.
I guess I
So
don't-
let's look at what a solar does. Does it smell?
No.
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 Does it make noise?
Not
No.
perceivable.
No. You might have some glare.
Yep.
What other concerns would be with a solar farm?
Just the look of it.
Okay, I have a neighbor who has a bright orange house. I mean, so really it goes to the glare of it.
The decommissioning and what happens to it after whoever is done with it.
I live by a lot of old farmsteads that I would really like to go in and clean up. And we would have it in the ordinance, that would be part of,
That would be
The
part of everything,
decommissioning,
would be a
so-
decommissioning plan.
so it has been addressed. I'm just trying to hit all of the, can I see it, can I smell it, can I hear it? There's no noise off these. So what would drive a half mile from a dwelling? It's gonna be glare. And I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here. What is the real concern?
Now, if you want to get I mean, it just depends, but I know, like I have written down here, I know there was an ordinance I looked at that, honestly, if I had somebody at my neighbor who was going to put in, say, 10 acres of solar panels, that's a lot different than looking out and seeing 2 sections worth. I would like that a half a mile from my house. See what I mean? So that's an option that I saw out there, is there was one county that looked at it and said, okay, hey, if you're gonna put in, 10 acres, 20 acres, that's not as intrusive, at least I think, than looking out and all you see is solar panels for 2 miles, which then I would want to have it to be a half a mile away.
And I'm not an attorney, but I know Sherry made a statement last week about that if all the boxes are checked, then we have to approve the CUP. And right now, there's not very places in our ordinance that you have any leniency to say, well, you know what, that's maybe not the best area to put this thing. And I think we ran into that with the substation down on Deer Boulevard. I don't know if there's a way that we can, like you say, if it's a 10-acre field or a 600-acre field, that if there's some place where the zoning board could say, no, we don't want it in that place, we gotta go someplace else, or move it, or yes, because it's only a 10-acre field, we can allow it at 1,000 feet or whatever. I'm just saying that I don't think we should be so restrictive either. I mean, if there's a way we can not back ourselves into a corner.
So and I think this was brought up before, and I've mulled this over too, is do we have another definition of whether, or another line drawn, not just on kilowatt size, but whether we are whether the intended purpose is to use it directly on the property versus being exported onto the grid? I mean, those are definitely 2 very big changes in how you're
And
operating.
we kind of went away from that specification last
Yeah.
week, but.
But then this way, perhaps, then we can have a setbacks, something that's being used on property is got whatever normal setbacks that the zone has. Something that is now being utilized for exporting onto the grid has a whole new set of setbacks, because it is going to be a large-scale system. No one's gonna put
Last
no one's
week,
gonna put in a 60 kilowatt system solely to sell to the grid.
yeah, last week we decided to go with 50 kW as a broad overarching principle, because if you if you begin to slice it too many ways, it gets too complicated. And we might consider continuing that same concept here, in that Rob told us that it would take about 80 by 80 to produce 50 kilowatts. And I believe I'm right that this scales up, output scales up along with size. I don't think you're ever going to run into a situation where technology becomes less capable. In other words, if we say that, and I don't know what the numbers should be, but just as an example, let's say we said 100 kilowatt system would have to have X setback, and a 500 kilowatt system would have to have X setback, etc., until you get up to the type of system that they put out in Pennington County, where it was 128 megawatts and it covered 1,500 acres. I think if you think of your setbacks in terms of the size of the output, you'll be able to account for all of the variability that you're thinking of right now. In other words, Lauren's point about I don't want a 1,000-acre solar farm within 500 feet of my house is a very valid point. And Sherry's point of, well, what about somebody, or maybe it was Ryan's point about some farmer that wants to put in an 80 kilowatt system to help him run his dairy farm. So I think if you key your setbacks to the output of the system, you'll have a reasonable metric that you can apply up and down the scale.
One way to do that would be you have your minimum setbacks, and then you could say, if it's over X amount, you add X amount of distance to each per watt.
Or
Yeah,
we just
that-
make a simple table that maybe is,
Yeah, that'd work.
here's you have no restrictions under 50 kilowatts, and then from there up to 1 megawatt, you have this setback, and then from there on, then we go to the half-mile setback
Yeah.
in this table.
That-
And so that you have this in-between area that perhaps that is, that has maybe a little bit lighter restrictions, but then it's like it allows maybe a commercial operation or a farm to have a slightly larger system to accommodate.
Guy Larson again. Just looking online at states in this region, what their setbacks are. Looking at Illinois, you can find graphs of numbers of counties in Illinois and their setbacks. And their setbacks and these are all commercial solar farms, large-scale farms. The setbacks range from a residence, 100 feet, to a maximum that I'm finding of 500 feet. I think if you set the thing at a half a mile, you're going to really eliminate much opportunity for Yankton to see one of these things, because people are going to look at that and say, oh, there are other places we could do this. I would really like to amplify what Sherry had to say. I would live with one on my fence line. I would love it. That would be great, but that's me. I understand that people have different perspectives, but I think, 500 feet, I think that might be a little bit on the strong side too, but it's certainly better than a half a mile.
So I think what we need to do is determine what the starting point is for the minimum, and then figure out some kind of scale to go up with size. And I think that to be consistent with our ordinance and what's already in those districts, I think that's reasonable to start at quarter mile and work our way up. I guess I get your arguments if I would want to live next to it too, or I wouldn't be bothered, but that's not the same for everybody. I know personally, I would have no problem living right next to my own feedlot, which I have, and today, by today's standards, if it wasn't grandfathered in for 100 years, I would have to have a half-mile setback from my neighbors, and I guarantee you they can't smell it. And I would have no problem living right next door to it, right on top of it, which my family has done for 100 years. And so I guess that's all a matter of personal opinion. And when you're getting up into these large scale, utility scale facilities, I understand the argument of, oh, it doesn't smell or doesn't make noise. Well, what's the difference between that and a giant warehouse building that just stands there and it takes up 1,000 acres? Would you want to live 500 feet from that as well? I mean, that's all personal opinion and kind of irrelevant arguments, I think, to be consistent and with what we've got, and to be fair with what's already going on in the districts we're talking about. I think that quarter mile is a reasonable place to start with whatever size, whether we say 50 kilowatts or 80 kilowatts or whatever there, and then make like a graduated scale up. Because obviously something with a larger footprint, you probably want to be farther away from.
Right, and for personal preferences, as Guy points out, we can always rely on exceptions. If, let's say there's a house within 20 feet of it, and they say, this is fine with me, and I'm more than happy to have it, then that solves that problem.
Diane Hopton, as someone who faced this issue a year ago with this possibility of the farmer putting this in on a large scale, he was looking for 1,000 acres. You know, a quarter mile in my mind is reasonable, even considering that I was looking this in the face a year ago, and I think that's a good starting point, and that's just my opinion too.
Good.
So you're saying start at a quarter mile and move up from there, or the
Yes.
maximum a quarter of a mile?
Well, quarter of a mile starting is what I would feel. I mean, I would have been happy if there would have been something in place last year and this was going to happen. I'd have been overjoyed if there could have been at least a quarter mile, and this was going to be over 1,000 acre prospect of what this was going to be. Because we were looking at it being right across, I was looking at it right across the fence from our house. Our house isn't very far from the road, and it was going to be right, right after the ditch on the neighbor's place. And thinking that it could have been a quarter mile away that would make me happy, and when I was facing this as in my own personal experience. The whole situation looks a lot different when you're facing it as being a reality in your life. And that's a year ago. That's kind of what we were facing, so.
Chime in too. The CAPO regulations recognize the threat. The threats are not only smell, but also water damage or runoff and stuff from a CAPO. Those are real and justify or whatever, drive those setbacks that are there. I know it's good to be consistent wherever you can. I'm an old logistics guy from the Army, so I'm in with that. However, the nature of the threats of solar are not anything like that from a CAPO, from a residential standpoint. The other thing that, because we came across this in the wind zoning stuff in Nebraska, you may want to differentiate from property line to property line setback, or property line to the first building, or property line to actual where someone's laying their head going to sleep. Because those are three different potential setbacks. If you're saying, because the house might be, like she described, right there at the edge, or the house might be way further back. So just something to
So
So-
those are delineated in here. It's also, it's by property line, delineating a change in ownership, 660 feet, residence, church or business, schools, 1320, municipalities, 2640. So that's there. And then I guess to the point of, if we want to put it against any kind of CAFO or any kind of ag use, you're looking at one of the differences being a large-scale utility. You're trusting most likely an out-of-state or a no-faith company to come into your county, build a huge project, and you're looking at putting less restrictions on them and trusting them to do it right. Whereas with these, any ag projects, you're looking at someone that's most likely been on that land for 100 years or more and is affecting their own land and has every incentive to do things right. Whereas you're versing that against a company that maybe doesn't have that incentive and whatever's the most profitable and walk away. So it is two different things. You're dealing with two different groups of people with different interests. And I think that it's only reasonable to be just as restrictive against an out-of-state or a company coming in and making a large project as it is our own residents that are trying to make a living in the county.
And I just want to add, a friend of mine down in Texas sent me a video of a solar farm getting put in down there. And it has totally, if you know, Texas got more rain in 10 days or 2 weeks than they did the whole year this spring. And that video, it was a news story, and you see the damage that that solar farm, because the company did not do things right when they're in the process of building the solar farm. It has totally destroyed the neighbor's property, destroyed the streams in every vicinity of that solar farm property. These people, these neighbors, their land is toast. And that's my main concern, is that making sure that the neighbors, wherever this is going, solar farm's going into, is protecting the next door neighbors. And I agree. You look at the contract that was issued to these landowners last year. It says right in there that the company has the right to sell it to anybody they want to. The lease can be sold to another company. Doesn't say American, any company. So it could be foreign. And I think, Chris has a great point. We're putting these less restrictions on somebody that's coming in from out of state compared to, in my case too, 100 years worth of family that has lived here in Yankton County. So to say that solar doesn't affect or doesn't cause issues with neighbors, that's not true. I've seen. That video is pretty powerful.
So we're actually talking about where we start with restrictions, which the minimum would be anything over 50 kilowatts would be starting, so we're talking about the setback starting at 51 kilowatts. And my opinion is, I think as a starting point, we can start at the quarter mile there. And I think that's a pretty strong restriction right there already.
Like they said, is that from where your head hits the pillow?
That would be,
Yeah, basically.
that's a quarter mile from the head hits the pillow,
Okay.
because we're talking about from residents or from dwellings, churches, schools, businesses, cemeteries. I don't know if the cemeteries is as important, but,
Well, I think in a way, I know some of them I've seen from Virginia, and granted, I know Virginia has a lot more historical places than South Dakota or Yankton County does. But, that is something to consider. Do you want a solar farm? What's the church in Mission Hill? That's how many years old? Vogden? Yeah, you think about it. Do you want a solar farm right out on the property line of, say, Vogden, or, something like that? So, we do have some historical places in Yankton County.
Let me add one thought to this, and that is that, in my experience, it's always easier to lighten up than it is to toughen up.
Yep.
And so, once it starts, whatever restriction you put in place, if it's less onerous, then you're stuck with it.
Have you taught? Have you ever been a teacher? Because that sounds like a teacher.
Yeah, yes, I taught economics for 10 years at Briarcliff.
You never could get harder with the class. You can only get easier.
And I've also been a boss and responsible for these kinds of things in another life. And one thing that's for certain is that you can come in tough and straighten a thing up, and then later on, once you see how it's working, you can lighten up. But if you come in and you try to play the fairy godmother and everything is unicorns and butterflies, you cannot toughen up. So keep that in mind with this. This is going to be a living document. And we will get another cut at it. So if I was going to lean in a direction, it would be to lean toward tougher, and to Chris's point, to be at least as tough on outside interests as we are on our people that actually live here.
And as you've discussed in the past, as technology gets better, maybe these will take less area and the setbacks will even be more, so more or less. So yeah, I think that's a good philosophy.
You know, and I think also at the half mile max for solar farm, the big one or whatever, if they're coming in, I don't see, there's not a lot of places in Yankton County, unless you get into some places down here in the southern end, where there's a house within, or a residence within, on all four corners within a half a mile. So if you need to go out and get a variance or a waiver from one person or two people, I don't see that being as a big issue if you're gonna still have a quarter of a mile setback. You know, if you make a quarter mile minimum for a huge farm, but our ordinance says a half a mile, and there's nobody within the area, then why can't they build it within a quarter of a mile of?
So our current red line that planning and zoning started with is residences, active church, business, schools, is quarter mile. Municipalities is a half mile. And then we have public wells, 1,000 feet, private well, 250 feet. So I do believe this is largely taken from KFO.
Yeah, pretty much
Yeah,
identical.
pretty much KFO restrictions as well. So I think that's kind of what I was just about saying was too, is like saying a quarter mile, so would be the residence. So I think we're largely in agreement here that we can stay with this table that we've started with from the planning and zoning.
Yeah, I think so.
So the setback is a quarter of a mile and not a
Yes.
half.
Not a half. This is the Clay County
Yeah,
setbacks, which are more.
ours is a quarter. I can live with that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. There was a mention about technology. The technology of silicon crystal panels has not changed since the 70s. The only thing that's changed is the manufacturing being streamlined and panels getting a little bigger. But the basic efficiencies involved in monocrystal and conversion to electricity are what they are. It's pretty fixed. So they won't become like this big down the road. They're always going to be probably a very similar size to what they are now. I think, we're again, in my view, it's a great discussion, and, 50 kW is one of those hard line in the sand. I think it's a good number, but it's like Murphy's Law. As soon as you get that, like that clear-cut definition, which you want to try to do, you're going to have something that's over and hard to live with those restrictions. So you may want to consider 50 kW cutoff or larger if it serves that site only, as kind of like an inclusion. Like if the farmer wants to put in 65, he can put in 65 under the 50 as long as it is just for his site. It's not a commercial site. Because people putting up solar panels to save money is the residents and the locals. I'm a protectionist too. Trying to save money and use the natural resources that are provided to them. And I don't know how you can do it in statute or in zoning, but absolutely, the guy feeding pigs for 100 years should be exempt from all this. But Smithfield, coming here from Beijing, not so much. Now, I'm not sure how you do that legally and all, but no, I agree.
Well, one of the things that we talked about in earlier meetings, Sherry brought up, was trying to delineate that by how it was mounted, like basically saying on a building, it's not taking up extra footprint, then we wouldn't worry about it. And then it could be larger. But we really never landed on a clear-cut way to delineate that.
Well, if there is interest in seeing those systems in Plainview, and it's a little bit far, but it does show the 3 different types of mounts that are available. And because we have it, it's a very good variety in one spot to see. Because you do have the roof mount, and then the analogous ground mount, and the pole mount. And obviously the pole mount is going to take up the least space. But cost-wise, the ground mount is the cheapest way to go, followed by roof mount and pole mount. So there are 3 different ways you can mount them, and you know, if there's interest, or I can just tell you, it's all public. I mean, you can go there yourself and see it in Plainview. But they have the demonstration of all 3 types there.
Where is that in Flandreau?
In the city.
You said next to the
It's on the
hospital?
res. Well, you know, the res is in the city. So it's all integrated.
Oh, it
Most
is,
of them are
okay.
all in that main square.
Okay.
Now, some are on buildings you can't see, but most of them are all visual. The one we're putting on now on the new Elder Care Center will not be visible from the ground. But most of them are. So if you're just in that area and want to go through, I mean, you can see them. It's all in that 1 or 2 block square.
Okay, moving on.
Yeah, I think we need to move on. I think we feel pretty good, and I agree. It's going to be a living document, sort of. You know, it's going to be like the sidewall height issue. We're going to get out there and we're going to see how this goes, but all of a sudden we might see like, oh, maybe we do want that 50 kilowatt limit raised just to avoid special conditional use permits and a lot of extra work for the board and county that doesn't really need to be happening. So, but I think, is everyone? Do we want to agree to that? setting?
State exactly what it is we're agreeing to.
Okay, so we are at for 50 kilowatts or greater, we are going to be a setback. The initial setback is going to be quarter mile from residents, active church, business, schools. Half mile from municipalities, and 1,000 feet from public wells, 250 feet from a private well.
Some of
That's-
them well ones could probably
I think we
be
can
taken out.
eliminate the well ones. They are not even. Now, lakes, rivers, and streams is 660 feet, which is 1/8 of a mile. Right-of-way line is 330 feet. And a property line delineating change of ownership is 660 feet at 1/8 of a mile. And then 100-year floodplain is prohibited.
I think that's a good starting point.
I agree.
I go with that.
Okay. I'm thinking. Yeah, I think we'll move on from there.
Okay.
Okay. On my, the kind of, and then we are going to add that landowner exception though.
Yes.
So that, if a place does wanna go out and get, waivers from residents within that boundary, they can and still, abide by the ordinance. And then I've noted also in the, particular Lynn County ones, they had a coverage limit with a cap essentially of total acres in the county that can be in solar farms. is that something that we want to entertain in this?
I don't know that we need a massive cap like that, but
Mm-hmm.
I would like to see a cap on tillable ground included in that area. I think one of them had 50% of tillable ground on the entire size of the farm. I think 50% is a little bit too large. I think if we cap it at 30%, so basically they could only take 30% of tillable land out of production. You're planting corn and soybeans in a section right now. I don't think we should eliminate 640 acres of corn and soybeans.
So do we limit CRP acres?
No, they're not tillable.
Not necessarily. I have tillable that's in CRP, because it was tillable. It has to have been in tillable to be in CRP program. And the whole point of putting it back in is it shouldn't have been.
But with a CRP acre, are you allowed by your government lease to put anything on that CRP land? Would they allow you to?
But the point is, I'm taking it out of essentially egg production. I mean, so I'm just trying to play devil's advocate.
Right.
Why would we put a limit on that?
I just don't think that we still need to produce food for the nation and for the world.
We need power too, to process the food.
There's still ways of getting power.
Well, so we already have a 660 foot off of a property line, delineating ownership, which for the most part, you'll have a 660 foot all the way around it. So it's not like you're gonna take a quarter section and the whole thing is just going to be solar panels. I'm just trying to play a little devil's advocate here, and getting back to the concerns of the process being put in. You know, if you were putting a nuclear processing facility out there, yeah, there'd probably be some concerns with bringing nuclear waste in and processing it and things like that. And I say this because I've sat through the discussions where people wanted to essentially come in and say, you can't put a damn hog barn in Yankton County. And I had to defend that you could, even if my opinion was not. And so now we've got a lot of the people, and I'm just gonna be blunt, we have a lot of people who are pro hog barn who hate solar, and we have a lot of people who are pro solar who hate hog barns. And we as a group need to look at the concerns of what's being presented in those and try to leave our opinions to some degree to the side and to play true devil's advocate. What are the concerns? Because when we talked about hog barns, there were concerns people brought up that, in my opinion, were opinions, having grown up on a farm with a hog barn. But they brought up concerns that were real. And so we have to be careful to leave our personal opinions to the side to some degree and bring an education to this table. So we, and maybe I'm just blabbering to blabber. So we need to look at what's the real concerns here, and at the end of that discussion, what limits are merited.
So, all right, I'm gonna do the math here. If you already have a 660 foot, an eighth of a mile setback that you can't build into. Let's say you have a whole section on one square mile.
640 acres.
1 square mile that is now gonna become a solar farm. Now, if we are abiding by that 660 foot setback,
Yep,
that means that around that border,
50% is.
43.75% is now not buildable. That would have to
Not
be set
buildable.
aside.
Okay.
So-
Add the floodplain on top of that.
And you add all the other restrictions we already have, I feel like this is
If that's the case.
just
then
adding a layer of red tape that we don't need.
I guess prior to when I brought that up, I didn't take into effect the 660 foot.
Yeah.
I agree with John. The whole reason, I can't live without food. I can live without electricity because our relatives did that for many, many, many generations, up until, what, when did electricity come to South Dakota? An acre of corn feeds a family of 4 for a year, plus some left over for their animals, give or take. And you can see different stats. That's my concern. And the thing, and I was just gonna say one thing. I wonder how much electricity's been produced by solar panels the last few days. I mean, honestly, my tomatoes are not getting red because there's not enough sunlight. You know, and the thing about it is my sister down in Kansas has solar panels. She exports maybe 3 months out of the year. You know, and that's the thing. I can live without electricity. And you say, oh, how can you? No, my relatives came to South Dakota and did that. I need food. And I do see that a lot of counties do what John just said. They have 50%. You can, if the soil is considered 50% prime farmland, you cannot build a solar farm on it. And that's what these counties do, is they say, hey, you can put a solar farm in unproductive land. Just don't take the good stuff, because that's needed for food.
And the reason I brought that up is I've actually heard from not a ton of people, but several people, that if you're gonna take our good tillable ground out of production by building solar panels on top of it, I don't want solar panels in Yankton County.
Yep, that's what I've heard too.
I don't agree with that, but I think if we put some kind of an amount on there that they, like you say, it's a 43 or what'd you say, 47%?
43.75% is already taken
On a
out
section
by,
of land.
by our setback.
Again, this is another reason to go tough in the beginning. And because Lauren makes a good point, it is not only true that Yankton County and the surrounding area are not just the best farmland in the United States, it's the best farmland in the world. The world is fed by the farm products that we produce. And also, I don't know if you guys got a chance to look at the solar maps that are on the U.S. Department of Energy website. This is not prime solar country. Prime solar country is in the desert southwest of the United States. Now, you know, the quip I've made is when you have all of eastern Colorado available to you, why would you build solar panels on the most productive farmland in the world? I'm not against solar energy. I think solar energy is a very, very, it's a gift, really. And, you know, Rob said that, and he's probably right since he's involved in it, but you know, silicon solar panels have been the way they are for quite a long time. But it's astonishing sometimes what technology can do. All of a sudden there's a breakthrough and we get an improvement. So I think we should stay tough, and if it turns out later that we were wrong, we can lighten up. But I agree with the idea that we are the breadbasket of the world, and we shouldn't be covering it up with things that produce electricity when it can be done better somewhere else.
So now going on that too, we've already taken out 43%
Yep.
on the border. And as we've already heard from Robert, that, you know, when you arrange these solar farms, you're not covering 100% of
Right.
the area.
Right.
And there is a lot of cases where you can grow productively on
In
the
between,
side,
that's
in
correct.
between. Now, when you talk about 50%, does that little bit of growing that you get between the panels and around the panels, that you may be able to do agriculture around, does that count against or for you in that 50%?
Yeah, I agree with where we are right now. I wouldn't want us to get any less restrictive. And as a matter of fact, also, I'm sure you saw in some of the information that John gave us, you can do grazing operations very successfully in the area where you have solar panels if you set it up right. If you raise it high enough, sheep and goats and other things can graze. So I wouldn't want to get any less restrictive than we are right now. I agree with where we are right now. But I don't want to see us cover up the whole county with solar panels.
Okay, so right now we have no caps in our proposed ordinance that the zoning started with.
Well, I think we do, actually.
With
we're
the
pretty-
With the
there's a-
setback.
With just with
a
the
lot of
setbacks.
setbacks,
Yeah.
and they're pretty restrictive.
But we
and
don't have any general 50%.
There's,
And that's
Yeah.
fine,
Okay.
I guess I didn't,
All
I
right,
didn't cooperate the
so
660 foot.
we'll move on without putting any caps.
yeah.
Sounds good. Guy,
I'm just gonna make 2 quick points, then I'm going to leave you people to do your work, and I won't bother you anymore. Number one, I'll point out that 66% of the corn raised in South Dakota is used for ethanol. It's not used to feed people directly. Indirectly, yes, but not to feed them directly. As far as being tough now and maybe lighten up down the road, that leaves you in the pretty position of never having to worry about it because you've set the bar too high for anybody to want to come here potentially. I mean, there's a Goldilocks spot that's tough to hit, but that's what you have to hit if you want to have any solar development in the county. And so I would, it's hard work, but I would do whatever you can to make it as embracing to solar energy as you can while still getting the protections that you need. So, good luck. I'll leave you to your work. Thanks.
Guy.
Thank you.
Can I throw up a quick issue? We've been talking about photovoltaic panels. There's another type of solar energy that would be totally inappropriate for Yankton County, and I think we should state what it is. It's called concentrated solar thermal power systems. I think we should come straight out and prohibit them in Yankton County.
Are those anywhere near here? Where do
No,
they
no,
put those in?
no.
Isn't that in California and Arizona?
Yeah, concentrated solar is a fielded technology. It is primarily in the solar green zones. I don't know that we'll see it here because we're frosty in the winter, and that would require different kinds of fluids to be used in a concentrating system, which runs a boiler, which turns a turbine. So that's probably not going to be, but you bring up there are many ways to use the sun. Some build carbohydrates into grain. Some build proteins and fats. I work with fats and oils and stuff as well. But solar energy can also be used for direct production of heat. The CSP you mentioned is one. That's big stuff. Although I do know some guys in India that make small ones.
That's the problem.
Well, the small one, actually, they made a stove, a solar stove. You guys are, see these pizza boxes, just a little home scale stove stuff, but they reflected the solar energy beam into the house and were using it like a stove.
Yeah, I used solar energy to cook a rabbit when I was in survival school.
Yeah, there you go.
So,
That's a portable system, though. I don't know if you
Yeah.
want to regulate that. But there are thermal solar systems, and they're not commercial, but that would be a residential thing. You may want to include in your language in the under 50K category. They would be a thermal solar where the sun hits the metal absorber, the black absorber, through a glass, or I use polycarbonate or whatever, and then there's an air path or water path for solar hot water heating or solar air heating. Those are typically on the roof or on the vertical south face of a building. There's no setbacks. It's all going to be building mounted. But for your zoning to be thorough, you may want to include that technology in the heading.
So
Yeah,
what do
I
you
think
call those
if
again?
We can.
Thermal solar.
We,
Thermal
Yeah,
solar
we
for
might-
residential use. It can be used on an agricultural building and stuff as well for preheating or heating.
Yeah.
yeah, I
But-
think for the most part, that's still kind of like, I think that's more, it's going to fall into that, under that 50 kilowatt range when you,
So as a
when you
permitted
calculate
use,
the
those
actual
things.
heat
But-
value.
Okay,
So-
I just want to bring it up that you may want it
You,
to be comprehensive.
yeah, you could incorporate that and then you just make a conversion of what your heat is into your kilowatts and,
Right, right.
and move on from there and,
Yeah, they
and-
use
and-
BTUs
yeah.
usually when they're rating those kinds of things, but I guess we could probably be more specific by saying the concentrating solar thermal power systems as defined at the U.S. Department of Energy website.
hmm And I agree, it's very, I have a friend that designs those plants
Right.
globally, and it's very unlikely we'll see one here simply because of the environmental conditions in South Dakota.
Right,
But,
but you just never know.
I think we can make a single line on that and
Yeah,
just say
one
that's
line.
prohibited.
That's all it
And
takes.
I think it has, we had that in the Lynn County one.
Right.
But going back onto the buffering, the other thing to talk about in citing these is drainage, topography, ground cover. Do we put requirements around those things for the farms, for the solar farms?
You're talking about the-
Drainage, looking at the drainage and topography of a site. Most of these farms want to be on level
Flat.
ground.
Yeah.
A flat level ground, it's just easier to position and obtain optimum angle to the sun. But we want to talk about drainage and ground cover. We don't want to see possibly having the requirements for maintaining the ground around it.
I think there should be something in there. I think that was throughout most of the ordinances I looked at. They said, whatever, sow it down with native grasses or species
Mhm.
to the area and basically keep it from being overgrown with weeds and that kind of stuff, generally speaking. I think that it would also be good in there if you have a large solar farm and like you mentioned that the hail doesn't really pose an issue most of the time, but in that one case where it would smash a bunch, we wouldn't really want it to wash a bunch of glass off or something into a stream or anything, which, yeah, we've got a setback, but is 600 some feet or whatever enough if you actually had a big event to keep that from running off, or should there be some kind of stormwater catch?
See, that's
or-
that's what I'm thinking too. Even if you had them put gutters on the bottom of the slope so that it drained to one area. I know gutters would be kind of overkill, but I seen one where they actually got a trench like right off of the bottom, the panel. They got kind of a trench with water drainage into that trench, and it's lined with clay, I'm sure, or bentonite or something, so that it flows to a catch pond of some sort. And I don't see that. I would recommend that we do something like that.
Well, there's gonna be extensive excavation, potentially leveling. They're gonna be drilling holes into the ground. A lot of them are screwed in, but, I mean, I work with the ones where you drill a hole, you fill it with concrete with the support, and then there's extra dirt. And so I think erosion protection, or erosion control at least, so you don't have stuff leaving the property.
Yeah.
I don't think the glass is gonna travel as much as a rock on the ground. Silicon and stuff is mineral, it's not an active component or dangerous. But I would recommend that the sites be fenced. Just like you'd fence a pool in the backyard, people messing around with wires and high voltage stuff like that, that's probably a good idea.
Yeah,
We got
that kind
screening
of goes
and
to
fencing
my
as our
next
topic.
is the screening and
Okay.
fencing. Again, we have this, we put this 50 kilowatt, and if someone goes to 60 kilowatts now, they have to have it fenced in. Is this a requirement that we really want? Because I'm pretty sure if you have a a 100 megawatt or or a very large installation, they're gonna fence it up, because it's significant investment.
You know, and there was one ordinance also, and I don't remember where it was at, it might have been in Kansas, where I read that, they had a fence around 3 sides of it and then a habitat, entrance, so that like deer or whatever could go in and
Yeah,
graze and do whatever. So maybe, I don't know. I agree with you though,
Yeah.
that if you're gonna build a 60 kilowatt array or whatever you wanna call that,
And then-
and it's only gonna take up, the size of a football field, do you really need to put a fence around that?
yeah, and then you also add in, well then, not just fencing it up, but it's all screening for,
Screening too,
for
yeah,
a slut,
yeah.
you know.
So I just think
Obviously,
that
you don't
we
wanna
gotta-
build, don't wanna shade all of your solar cells that you just put in with tall trees, but, you know,
I
there's
think for
probably
some of
things
these-
that we can do for screening, at least to keep it from being too visually invasive to
Well,
the
you can put
area.
lilac bushes around it, they won't
Well,
grow
you
too
could-
tall.
Well, if you're talking about the large scale facilities, if there's
Yeah.
600 feet from a property line or 300 feet from a right of way, that's plenty of feet to put screening in that where it's
Mhm.
not gonna shade your panels or anything.
Yeah,
So I don't think that would be an issue if you wrote it so that the screening, buffering, whatever, can be in that area.
On the screening and or fencing issue, obviously commercial needs done, but, you know, here we go again with that 50 number, you know? So maybe it's more simply done and more consistently done that net export facilities are fenced. And if you guys approve or 70 on a farm, that's not net export, they're self-consumption. So maybe the commercial sites, which are set up for net export, need to be fenced for liability or whatever. The other thing I'd mention on the vegetation, this is a little challenging with ground mounts, and it's good that you have a mention of weed control, because the weeds will grow under the panels.
Right.
The grass, I mean, you're not gonna get anything desirable to grow under there. On small systems, I've seen people landscape it, so it is, you know, roll the weed cloth out, and then it's done. People seen, you know, they round up it and keep it clean, but they don't care. A commercial guy isn't gonna care until the weeds maybe pop through the panels and shade it. But it'll look, you know, the looks would be pretty bad if they didn't have a.
That's why you graze sheep underneath it.
I got goats, I put them out there.
They'll eat the weeds before they eat the grass.
Well, we gotta remember, if we're just doing the 50 and over, the conditional use ones, you can always put a condition on it, as long as you all know, we've been through a lot of those discussions. If we're consistent about it, so that we're doing the same things on each project, you can just put conditions on it and not have to worry about saying something specific in the ordinance.
I think it's good to have it in the ordinance though, just so that someone that's looking at doing a project knows exactly what they're getting into before they do it. And then the one thing, if they're landscaping underneath the panels or keeping it bare, doesn't that create more issue with the erosion and everything else with runoff from the property?
The rain is only gonna hit mostly on the downhill side. It's not hitting those areas that may not have growth underneath. So I haven't seen much of that. Most of the time, the solar panels are pretty flat, on flat spots, so there's not a whole lot of movement going on.
That's why I think, you know, you do a job description, and the last line in the job description is pursue other duties as necessary. I just wish there was some way that we could write in our whole ordinance that gives the zoning board some leniency on all of the zones, all of the ordinances versus, I mean, you check these boxes and you're automatically qualified for it.
I agree. I really do. You know, if you get it to the point where the zoning board has to approve something, if it checks all the boxes, a computer could do that.
Mhm.
You know, all you need is a decision tree, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, and boom, you're done. So we have human beings on the planning board for a reason, and we should give them discretion to either add or subtract as appropriate.
See, that's where I think, you know, when you say we should have it written into the ordinance somewhere, that would be the challenge, I guess, is to write it into the ordinance, but still allow us to have the discretion.
Well, maybe a lot of discussions on that, is the consistency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think it goes to appearance. We're talking about weed control. Erosion is pretty cut and dry because there's a physical thing happening. But I think if you put something in that goes to appearance, that says we expect you to keep it up. And that might be different. There's a little bit of leeway in there. Fence repair, weed control, you know, no junk vehicles, you know, just some basic stuff and kind of a catch-all phrase.
Because that's the thing, that thinking about screening and putting up trees is the fact that I would require something different if it was along Highway 81 coming into Yankton, compared to, you know, out where, you know, where there's just a few, you know what I mean? And so that's the thing, because if you look at a lot of these ordinances, it's very different. You know, some require double tree rows, some require, you know, there's even one, it depends on the size of the farm. You know, if it's smaller, less, you know. So I guess I would be in favor of allowing, when they come before the board, the commission, to give us leeway to say, oh, this is located in a prime, or, you know, right next, you know, I'm thinking like our state hospital ground. You know, you'd want to have a good buffer between that solar farm and the state you know, grounds, you know, compared to something that we have over by Vollant, you know what I mean?
I guess just writing in there, you could say that they have to provide a site plan or acceptable site plan for the proposed location, and then.
That sounds
Yeah.
very good.
Well, when you, like I've mentioned before, if you drive to Minneapolis from here, you'll see a number of these things. They're not fenced, they're not screened. They're just sitting 50 feet off the highway. It's just,
Yeah, and I saw that in Montana too, when I was there in June. You know, they're right along the road. What's the liability? That's what I'm saying with like fencing.
Yeah.
You know, you're saying like if you have a small one, you should need fencing, but I'm thinking, you know, if you put in how many, I mean, what's the, I guess I'd want to have a fence to protect my investment.
Protect your investment, but there's a safety issue there too.
Yeah.
Unlike you're dealing with panels lower to the ground, there is larger voltages, you know.
Yep.
A few hundred volts of DC is not pleasant.
Well, I have to check with your state electrical inspector, but I know from in terms of touching, they have started to require that netting, and we use like the snow fencing, that underneath the wiring, underneath the panels is protected there. So you can't reach up and grab a wire, and everything else is in conduit.
Yeah.
So a situation like that is probably going on because the precautions are taken at the installation, on the installation. They fence the back of the panels, there's no exposed wires that you can grab. So that might have been a, you know, kind of a balance they struck with that. Because I know that has tightened up in past years, where they could be hanging and now they have to have another thing, everything in conduit from up high and solid, so you can't, there's nothing you can like unplug.
So, all right, so I think we have acceptable site plan. A few other small things that were in the ordinance. I don't think we won't have to have a minimum lot standard because ag already has those minimum lot standards. So there's no need to double down on that. The next really big thing was really talking about the structures. One that we haven't really covered over is height. We have the current red line ordinance has 20 feet. How's the feeling on that? I know the higher up you go, that gives more opportunity for growth of vegetation underneath and better ground cover.
maybe you can answer this. What's the, one thing that, when I'm looking at all this and thinking, what's the cost difference? Because when I looked at photos of a tractor going underneath a solar panel and they're way up in the air, I'm thinking, what's the cost for that compared to closer to the ground, where you can't drive a tractor on it? That's what I'm wondering. What is it?
Well, the economic one, I mean, the big guys are gonna do whatever the cheapest is, okay? But generally on the not so massive scale, it costs more, so your ground mount's gonna cost about $1.80 to $2 a watt installed cost. Okay, your roof mount, depending, if it's standing seam, it's $1.80 a watt. If you gotta go with lag bolts looking for beams and stuff, it could be $3 or $4 a watt. Pole mounts will be about $4 a watt.
Double.
Yeah, because it's actually more, there's a lot that's suspended off a central pole, so everything has to be kind of oversized. We did this in not in Yankton, in Blandrew, where we didn't jack them up enough to drive something under it per se, because then there's a balance again with the wind shear. The higher up you go, the more wind. So you're kind of being exposed there, unless you had a good reason to do it. You didn't want to block access, or there has to be some good reason to get them that high. But we elevated them enough, we added like three feet of concrete. Instead of being flush with the ground, we put the sonotubes in, brought up another 3, 4, 5 feet, I don't remember. It didn't add that much cost to do that, but it was a little more steel, it was a little more concrete, might have added $1 a watt to the cost, but it became usable space underneath there.
That's what I was gonna say,
Grow the
yeah.
grass and push your
Yeah.
mower and put a picnic table out or whatever. So those might be, in your opening statements on this, where we recognize that renewable energy is a resource available, we encourage the use of blah, blah. We also encourage the use to integrate solar into the landscape in which you plan to put it, raise the sheet.
So-
Encourage people to be creative with it.
So in that, we have a maximum height. Do we want a minimum height? So that we can sort of enforce that, so that it can be,
Well, the minimum height is like on a ground mount, well, obviously, we're only talking about ground mount. Pole mount's gonna be tall. It's gonna be overhead height, at least. I don't see any reason if you're building over 20 feet with solar, something's going on.
Well, by the way they define is the top of the panel, so like if the panel's hanging up there, the top point of it,
Yeah,
20
so
feet.
20 feet.
None of them
no,
get that
you
tall?
won't hit that. That's good, because if you're going about 20 feet with a solar panel, something's up. But there is a minimum on the ground mount, because you've got snow drop. So that snow is, when it does melt, is gonna slide and pile at the bottom. And you want that to be, in Nebraska, I never went below 30 inches on that bottom edge. But up here, I mean, after last winter.
Yeah,
you
in
know,
January.
That's something you may wanna, because you can't really tell them how they're gonna build it, but they're gonna decide for themselves on the snow, on the minimum, because of the snowfall.
but I'm saying if you put a minimum in, that sort of that will encourage that you have better ground, your ground is kept better underneath too. If you put your minimum, say it's something where it's just enough to where you can really make sure that you can get underneath there with mower equipment and everything like that, and then it sort of really enforces that it's gotta be a well-kept area. Does it sound unreasonable to say 6 feet, of minimum height?
What was
Or,
it?
That'd be high, I would,
You know.
maybe 3
4?
feet.
4 feet?
Okay, what that does, if you go more, like if you wanna put in 3, I think 3 feet for most cases is probably enough. You might have exceptional years, but what that does, if you're 3 feet at the bottom and you're at a 20-degree angle, now you're 10 feet over here, which creates, now you're having to work, or, that's a less safe environment, working on top of a ladder, getting up, there's a balance. Because wherever you start, just boosts
Yeah.
where you end. I think anywhere 3 to 4 feet would be.
Yeah.
4 is kind of on the high side, 3 would, I think nobody in their right mind would do less than that anyway.
So,
Well, let me ask, do you guys have, is there a certified installer? Okay, so if I hang my little shingle up and Joe Smith wants me to put 5K in his yard, do you require anything of me as a competent person to do this?
well,
Not at the county level.
yeah, currently there's nothing right now.
And that's probably, I mean, that's the way it was in Nebraska, but I think some of the more, some of the bigger solar states have different requirements for people, and if you have that, then you ain't gonna worry about stuff like that. You know, a competent installer is gonna know that.
Well, that goes back to one of my lines is, do we want to require a professional engineer stamp on these designs,
I think just about
on these
everyone
larger
right.
Not a
designs?
wet stamp.
What?
Not a wet stamp. I mean, you can go like Iron Ridge, big company, you can go on their little website, and they're one of many. You know, go on and do the little thing on the thing and print it out, bam, it's all pre-designed. This is not, we're way past the years where, you know, an engineer's actually got his little ruler out. Wet stamp in this day and age is really excessive, because there's so much computer stuff out there where people can just, it's all pre-designed, it's all pre-engineered. So I would say no on the wet stamp, but you may have, you know, a lot of times the installer certifications are pretty, you know, extensive. So you may wanna just have just a basic competency test or something that, you know
think-
The state
somebody knows
has
what
like
they're doing.
certified installers for septic. but
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think the state has anything for certified installer and solar.
I'm sure not.
And I definitely don't think it's the county wants to get into that business of certifying anyone for this
Well, on your,
stuff.
well, on the city application, it asks all about installer information, who's doing it, what their name and number is.
Yeah, and that can be the self-installer too, you know, for
Yeah.
certain things, so.
Well, you wouldn't ask, you know, somebody working out of the back of his pickup truck to come and do electrical work on your house. It seems to me like we could, at least require that they be, a licensed electrician?
No,
No?
The state has
Well-
that
for an installer of
requirement
systems.
for electric and plumbing already.
So is it already taken care of then, Gary?
Inspection for electric and plumbing.
So if
That would be
they're
an
ins-
inspection after the installation.
Yeah,
Yes.
but if they're installing a solar system, then the state has us covered on that?
Not
Well-
the solar that I'm.
Well-
If you connect into the grid, you still have, they do want to inspect the connection into the grid.
Right.
And that's for any size system. going
Sherry,
up.
who installed yours?
A gentleman up by Sioux Falls.
So evidently, there's somebody around that,
There's a couple, yeah.
so,
Well, did they have to be certified?
Well, certainly, we hooked into BY Electric, and they came out and looked.
Right, because you hooked it in.
You bet.
But if you don't hook it in, I mean, you're,
Well, if you don't hook it in, that's another whole thing, you don't even want, that's a can of worms you don't even wanna touch. But
I understand
on the
that.
res,
But even if a farmer rewires his barn, you're looking at potential problems if you know, if people don't know what they're doing with electricity, you'll have a fire. There will be a fire if they don't know what they're doing. And so, you know, no bank, and I've been a banker for 10 years as well, no bank would loan money on a project unless the person doing the building and the person that does the electrical and the plumbing are licensed and bonded.
Okay,
That's a fact.
so the solar installer does not work with the AC wiring. Okay, so in my world, I don't, I mean, I have for my own, because I couldn't even get a guy, but the solar installer's scope is from the panel, basically to the inverter on the DC side. Everything from AC over is licensed electrician. So
Oh.
my question was, do we wanna put something in there, even if it's just not a certification or anything you have to enforce or whatever, but a competent or experienced.
Or do we have to just make the statement that it has to be built to the NEC code? The hard part is that's always an after the fact enforcement.
Yeah.
It only comes up after there's a problem.
Well, if you mess up on the DC side, it's gonna happen on the AC, it won't produce power.
Right.
So if there's any problems gonna happen, it's gonna be on the AC side, and that's all inspected by the.
One thing you can do is throw in a term called in a workmanlike manner. That's what banks do.
Or best practices.
Best practices in a workmanlike manner and leave it at that. And then at least you've addressed it from a liability point of view, which, by the way, when we were talking about fencing, it just strikes me that boy, I don't see any substation that doesn't have a big fence around it. And, you know, we're producing, 8 kilowatts of power, which is what it would take to power a house. That's a lot of electricity. That's how I keep the deer out of my garden, with an electric fence, and it gives them a heck of a shock. And the only reason it doesn't set things on fire is because there's no impedance. And so just from a liability point of view, it seems to me that the county should protect itself by requiring at least some access restriction to the solar field itself.
Yeah, and then again, we're talking about things that are going to be 50 kilowatts or larger, so they are
Right.
going to be, we're looking at like 0.15 to 0.2 acres.
Yeah.
You think about our minimum lot size for a residence is half an acre, so you take half of that and turn it into a solar installation. That's what we're talking about fencing in.
I don't know.
An area kind of like about a quarter of an acre.
Yeah.
On the smallest side.
What's your
So is
experience
that
in this,
too
Rob?
much of a requirement?
On the fencing,
Yeah.
I've just seen the bigger ones I've always seen the bigger ones fenced. And the ones that are residentially used for self-consumption are not, except that, like I mentioned, the state electrical inspector will come through and make sure nothing is grabbable.
Okay.
Yeah, and so again, we're not talking about the residential ones.
Right.
Those are not our concern in this thing. We are really concerned about the larger ones, and so I feel like,
And I think the big guys they're gonna wanna put a fence around their
Yeah.
facility. I mean, just like you say with the substations, they're gonna put it around whether they're told to or not.
and we do have that in the red line.
Yeah, it's in the red line that have a fence, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we're only talking about above 50 kW for the licensing of the installer, they're not gonna mess around with the guy in the pickup truck. I mean, they're gonna
Right.
have, if not internally, the expertise. They're obviously, for their own funding and certification, are gonna use.
You're gonna call Sherry and get the phone number for the people that installed hers, so.
All right, so I'm gonna move on, okay? I think we've kind of covered, we're probably gonna just use some language to cover the design part, as Mike had said, and so, and we kind of gone over the heights. The other thing I kind of really think, and especially with the issue with the substation on Deer Boulevard, is the routing of connections, especially when you have one that is going to be feeding into the grid, a large installation. It's going to have a transmission line to the grid, probably.
And I've seen in some ordinances where they restrict it. They say that the solar farm has to be built within so many, half mile, whatever, of any transmission lines to prevent the,
Mm-hmm.
So the bigger farms running through the inverter to the transmission line, is a transmission line like that big power line that goes 4 miles north of town? That's a transmission line?
Depending on the size,
And they would be able to just basically tap into there somehow?
they'll probably have to step it up to 480. And,
Right,
you know,
right, but
get
I
the
mean,
right
take your
thing, but yeah, they're gonna
power
try
line
to
and snap it on there and it's good to go?
Put the alligator clamp.
Yeah.
BY is all over that. Because if you look at the tier 2 and 4 applications in BY, it goes from like tier 1 and tier 3 or less than 10, less than 50 is like 1 page, which that's at least good to see. The tier 2 and 4, you need to have like electrical engineering background to start filling these out. They're all over that because they're doing that survey. How close, where can we bring them in? Is this feasible? Way before they're even gonna be talking.
My concern though is I looked through those two. They are looking at where it's connecting into their existing grid. Now, the route between that existing grid to
Gary,
no, I think you can probably lock.
I think you could lock it,
Yeah.
we can
Yeah.
we can leave with them locked.
Yeah.
Either way, or I can get them when I go.
Anyway, so my concern here is when I was looking through this and thinking about that substation is I think it's maybe not unreasonable that if you have a large installation that's going to require a transmission line to tie into the grid, that transmission line route is clearly defined in the site as part of a site plan.
Yeah.
Site
It's a
plan.
requirement
Yeah.
for passing because we don't want to have another one where like, oh yeah, we'll get it done.
Yeah.
And then there's the hard part of finding all the easements that they never thought of and all the other problems. So
So not just the agreement, we want a site plan
Yep.
for it also.
yes,
Yeah,
it's
and
the
we
site
can't
plan, but
assume-
it also has to have where that ties in.
We can't assume
how.
that just because they're professionals in the electrical business that they'll think of that ahead of
Mhm.
time. And so you really have to have it in your site plan.
And that's, again, it's like, that could be a 7K line that they're tying into or
Yeah.
something like that. And that means that they have to have a transformer station stepping that up. So,
Yeah, I think that basically the big farm is gonna have the responsibility of getting it to grid quality
mhm.
and generally bringing it to the grid. I've seen where they've scratched each other's back kind of thing, and we ended up in Burke County, we saw some lines get built by the power company for them to deliver it to them. And I didn't have time, you don't have time to dig into everything in the world, but that seemed like that was on the ratepayers' back to do that. But it'd be good for that to be disclosed right up front in application.
Do you think, I don't think that's a bad requirement at all to have all that on there as part of the site plan. And then, as far as actually in the field, as far as when I've researched all this, pretty much everything is DC. They're gonna bury their lines, for the most part. And that's really just gonna be covered under NEC code. And that's all, and that should probably also be part of the site plan, where the buried lines are, how they're being routed,
I agree.
because we just want to make sure that we see a well-planned. It's not like we're gonna tell them that they have anything wrong, but we want to see that it's all done. Okay, the next thing around this is, we're talking about site plans now, external to the site plan, roads and access to these sites, because they're all gonna be, sounds like they're all gonna be in ag, these larger ones. And,
I see the biggest issue is just gonna be when it's constructed, and then when it's decommissioned will be the heaviest use on the roads. Otherwise, in between that, it'd be fairly minimal to my guess. You'd just be visiting it once in a while with a service truck or something, but
And then the farm that was being proposed by us, or was being considered by us, it's no maintenance, so what would be the responsibility of the township is kind of what we were wondering, because that's a dirt mud road that borders this property. So what, our township, what would their responsibility have been when that would have started? I mean, what would have had to happen in order for them to build it then?
See, and that's, so again, like, it's, their heavy use of the road would be during the construction phase and decommissioning phase, and should we put a new?
We have road haul agreements, don't we, that we enforce now?
Well, I was thinking, is there a way we could put an enforcement that says that post-construction, it's the final part of the construction, that the road is restored to full quality, or to the quality it was?
Yeah, for
And the same thing with decommissioning.
That's pretty much, yeah, in the road haul agreement.
Yeah, okay.
and I think they should also have to provide you a estimate, like on these large scale utility facilities. They should give you an estimate of how much usage they're going to have on the road in the in-between time, because I guess I'm just guessing that most uses when
You know,
they're building or decommissioning, but I mean, they should be able to outline, say, yeah, we're gonna have a service truck there 3 times a week looking at it or something, you know, so that you know, just that it's wrote
You
in the
know,
plan.
and Guy would probably have a problem with this, but I would be in favor of whoever's coming in to build that site, set up an escrow account at one of our local banks. Because a bond, anybody can call on that bond. A surety bond, anybody can call on the bond, or they don't have to renew that bond when it comes due a year or 5 years. An escrow account is there. If they put $500,000 escrow in the bank account, and if we never use it, they can collect it at the end of the decommissioning.
I agree with John. I think an escrow.
Dealing with truck brokers and things like that, bonds are absolutely not worth the piece of paper they're written on.
Yep.
I mean, unless there's
Yeah.
something else
So
in
how,
the,
how do, how do
in
we
the
set the value of that escrow?
I don't know, I guess that would be something that, when they come to the planning commission, I think like Chris said, give us an idea, give us an estimate. There's some of these that actually request an estimate, require an estimate for reconditioning or, for the road
then
agreements and things like that. So I
Obviously,
think
we would have our highway superintendent take a
obviously we
look
could
at it
have Mike-
and,
I could have Mike take a look at that too.
and
so-
assure us that it was good and accurate and,
And I think having a,
PUC does that for the 100 megawatt
Mhm.
and more ones already, that they set that kind of stuff.
yeah, and I think it'd be good to,
So many percent per year and.
Yeah.
it would be
And
good to
obviously
see an
it's-
estimate, because I've seen some, I don't remember which resources I was looking at anymore, but it was something out of Minnesota, I think, and they were showing a decommissioning estimate of how much it would cost, and when you actually go through the line by line on there, some of the things was like remove the concrete underneath the poles or whatever, and it was
4
like,
feet.
it was like, yeah, for 4 feet for the whole site for like, I don't remember, it was like a 2 or 3 megawatt facility, but like $2,500. It's like,
Yeah, I did see that.
I know that's not accurate just by looking at it, but,
Yeah.
so it'd be good for them to actually give you a written
mhm.
plan of what this is going to cost, or like the road use. That way, I mean, just from looking at it, you can tell, well, that's absolutely not reasonable, or, yeah, it sounds about right.
On 100 megawatts or more, the state, and this would be for the Oglala one, I think, yeah, the one that was built out there on the reservation. They've got 10 points here just on roads. And it's mostly building. So I think if there's any, and then again, going back to Rapid City's problems out there, building that one out at New Underwood, it's been the roads. And so I think we need to take time to really make sure, because, you know, the water truck was going past my house today, keeping the dust down from the gravel trucks. And so, I mean, if you just think of people, I mean, I think if there's anything we need to spend time on, it's making sure that this roads is pretty tight. And, because that could cost the county,
Yeah.
the commissioners. yeah, coming back and bite us, you know?
And along with the escrow account, I think we also need to make sure that we have a hold harmless agreement with insurance policy, naming us as additionally insured.
Question, like the road halt agreements, is that the township? Who initiates the town? Yeah, because like, for like our gravel pit, we had to go to the township and get an agreement there first, right? If I remember right?
It's county and township.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, because I know we had to work with, yeah, so, okay,
We did both signatures.
okay. I guess on the roads, I'd like to spend some time researching that for next week, if that, you know.
We can put that on for next week, yes.
Yeah, and just have for
That
all of
would-
us to
what-
research to, because
we can
again, I
follow
just
up.
think that's so important.
Yeah,
So important, especially if you're dealing with minimum maintenance roads possibly in this county and township roads, and we don't want what happened Tuesday night happen again with
Mm-hmm.
294.
yes. Well, I have one last thing on here that I had on my list when I read through all these ordinances, and that was that some of them had restrictions on mixed uses, and this gets difficult when we have such a low limit where we're starting to apply, because obviously when we get to like a 10 megawatt facility or something like that, we may want to have this restriction that it's also not, you can't have a 10 megawatt facility and storage site and truck stop or something like that. So I don't know if that's something we want to address, or do we,
Well, for a mixed use, say that you wanted to put, like you said, a 10 megawatt facility, and then you're gonna have like a truck stop or something on the corner, that other commercial business would all require its own CUP, wouldn't it?
yeah, we would want to have that separate. So, and that's, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's the way the ordinance is wrote now,
Mhm.
is that it would require its own
CUP,
for
yeah.
a mixed use like that, but, I guess, would that cover any other mixed use, like we're talking about, like grazing under it, that's already permitted in the zoning district, so it doesn't require a permit, so even though, yeah, it's mixed use, there wouldn't be anything else
Yeah.
to deal with there.
So I guess I just brought it up because that's some of them that were in the ordinances. I'm like, okay, is it something we have to address, or is that something that we feel confident?
I think there is a difference if you're talking about like differentiating between if you're just producing with solar panels or you do have like a storage site. I think that could be an issue. Wasn't the facility out west, wasn't it where they were gonna pump water up into a basin and then with, I assume, wind or solar or something, and then run it back through?
Yeah, pump storage project.
Yeah, something like a pump storage, would that be like type of mixed use you're talking about?
Not really, because that's still all about power generation.
Give an example, what do you mean?
Well, mixed use would be more like from what I understood on these ordinances, is like, yeah, exactly, like storage of like, oh, we have this farm here, or the solar farm here, but we're also gonna store all of our utility trucks for the linesmen here, and create it like a utility depot as well, and,
Here's solar area is right next to the airport. So,
mhm.
Yeah, I don't know. If you were using like maintenance facilities for that project, I think that would kind of get all rolled into like the site plan and everything, wouldn't
Yeah.
it, Gary?
yeah.
That's kind of how most projects are now. If it's directly related to that thing, it's kind of included.
Yeah,
If it was a totally different use, like we've had the issue with like campgrounds and then having storage units, well, they're sort of related, but not really. They're totally separate. So then
so I think what you're saying is, we can handle that at the planning board level
I
with
think
site
we already
plans.
kind of differentiate there between.
Okay. Well, I think that's gone through the list I had. Does anyone else have something?
Ryan, before we all get away, I talked to you about I talked to all of you about having someone come in and give us a tutorial, and frankly, Rob, you've done a pretty good job today, but I did contact Stephanie Horst, who is the CEO of BY Electric, and she is willing to come next week and give us about a 30-minute presentation on some of the things that we probably don't know about, which would be the technicalities of hooking up to BY Electric and what sort of limitations they might set on a commercial producer, or another word, or a better word might be a commercial interface between them and a commercial producer. So I hope it's okay with everybody that I've invited her, and she's agreed. And I told her that I want the Joe Friday routine, just the facts, ma'am, in the presentation, because like I said, I don't think we need to have an advocate one way or the other. On the other hand, she's also agreed to answer questions, and you can imagine that we might get into well, this is better or that's better in the question and answer period. So if that's okay with everybody, she's going to be here at 3 o'clock next time we meet.
Yeah, sounds good.
Do you want
Thank you.
that stated on the agenda, or do you want to get more specific on the agenda, or keep it general like I have it?
I like general.
I like general, I think we can add the,
Because
for
you're
the,
gonna be talking
yeah.
about so many different things, that's why I did it that way.
I think we can, but for Stephanie coming in, I think we can have that as an agenda item. And
Yeah.
then also, let's have the follow-up on the roads as an agenda item, and then we would then,
Discuss rest.
further discussion is environment and decommissioning.
Right,
Oh,
right.
I did, I found a contact at Broyne Enterprises in Sioux Falls. Reached out to him to possibly come down or at least answer a few questions that I have. And he has not gotten back to me, but he is on vacation this week, so.
Okay. Yeah, as soon as you find out, yeah, we can
Yep.
hopefully maybe have him on the agenda as well.
And I don't want to complicate our task any more than what it already is, but it strikes me as a former banker that if somebody came to me looking to start a project, I was always very interested in all the details of their project, and when they got done explaining it, I always asked them, how do you make money? Because a lot of times people forget to tell you that, or maybe they haven't even thought of it. And so it seems to me like it might be wise for the planning commission to at least have the applicant tell them how the economics of this project will work.
Present a business plan, basically.
I would say it's pretty close to a business plan. It's at least a pro forma that says, if we do this, here's what we expect the outcome to be in terms of dollars and cents.
So I'm gonna play devil's advocate again, it seems that's my role. Do we ask any other use in our ordinance to do that?
I don't know that we do. Maybe we should. The reason I bring this up is because I've looked at it, and boy, it just doesn't seem to pencil out.
Someone could say
Yeah.
that about farming today too.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I know.
So
I
we
know.
need to be careful
Yeah.
with doing that in an ordinance that's.
Yeah, it's just that it seems to me like it would be at least something that they should address.
Well-
Whether you're using that as a decision factor or not is
We're here today because we know that there's interest in building solar farms.
right.
Now, whether they're profitable or not, or how they make their
It's no
money,
concern of ours.
is not our problem.
Okay.
That is,
Alright.
I
We need to
do feel that.
decommission in 6 months, that's what it is.
Yeah,
Alright.
and making sure that they do their project and they clean up after themselves, that's pretty much all we have to say about it,
I'm
so.
okay with that. Fine.
So what are you thinking for next time to talk about for topics?
You said roads, environmental stuff, and decommissioning. and then the Stephanie Horse.
I think that'd take up pretty much. the
So
whole time.
environmental as when it's being built, when it's in
Environmental
into operating.
During
and-
and decommissioning.
Beginning, middle, and
The whole
end.
thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I kind of, when we kind of gone over that, we won't get through all of that next week. That'll hopefully be part of our last meeting as well, so.
So environment means the taking it apart.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, we will get through. I don't think we'll get to that.
I make a motion to adjourn.
I second.
Thanks for all
All
your
right.
work. This is what, you're gonna spend a lot of time just studying this, and it takes a lot of your personal time, and I'm just impressed by that, and I appreciate it about counties that do this, so.
Thanks. Okay, all in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, we are adjourned.
Under financials, that's probably too much, but you may want to consider past performance evaluation.
What's that again?
Past performance.